A black engineer moves to a quiet suburban neighborhood in search of peace, but his new neighbors have other plans. A loud, overbearing family next door turns his dream home into their personal playground, ignoring every warning he gives. But he's not the type to be pushed around. After repeated violations, he decides to fight back, not with fists, not with the law, but with strategy. What he does next shocks everyone, and sends a message the entire neighborhood will never forget. Malek Carter stood at the edge of his new backyard, taking in the serene beauty of the space he had worked so hard to call his own. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, its golden glow shimmering on the surface of the crystal-clear pool. A gentle breeze rustled through the neatly trimmed hedges lining the yard, carrying with it the distant hum of suburban life, birds chirping in the trees, a lawnmower droning somewhere down the street, and the occasional bark of a dog. It was peaceful. Exactly what he had wanted. Exactly what he had needed. For Malik, this wasn't just a house. It was a sanctuary. A place where he could finally breathe, finally let go of the weight he had carried for the past 3 years. After his divorce, he had thrown himself into work, burying himself in blueprints, project deadlines, and the ceaseless demands of his career as a civil engineer. It had been a necessary distraction, a way to drown out the silence that had filled his tiny apartment in New York City. But when his promotion came through earlier that year, something shifted. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to think beyond work, beyond the grind. He had saved enough, built enough, endured enough. It was time to reclaim his life, and that started with reclaiming his peace. That's what led him here to Willow Creek, Georgia, a quiet suburban town just far enough from the chaos of the city to feel like an escape, but close enough that he wouldn't feel isolated. The house itself was everything he had envisioned, a modern single-story home with an open floor plan, high ceilings, and expansive windows that bathed every room in natural light. But it was the backyard that had sealed the deal. The pool, pristine, inviting, surrounded by a sleek stone patio and a tall wooden fence, was exactly what he had dreamed of. A place to unwind after long days, to sip a cold drink in the evening while the sun dipped below the horizon, to feel weightless in the water as he let the tension of the world fade away. The neighborhood had seemed perfect at first glance. The Walker family, an elderly couple who lived across the street, had greeted him with warm smiles and a plate of homemade peach cobbler the day he moved in. To his right, a young couple, Bryce and Natalie Powell, had introduced themselves, their newborn baby nestled in Natalie's arms as she handed him a small basket of muffins. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she had said cheerfully. Malak had appreciated the gesture, even if he wasn't the overly social type. He wasn't looking to become the life of the block, but he liked the idea of living in a place where people were friendly yet respected each other's space. And then, there was the Hendricks family. They lived to his left, in a house that was just slightly larger than his, with a well-maintained front yard and a basketball hoop mounted above the garage. Derek Hendricks, the father, was a towering man with a booming voice and an easygoing smile, the kind of guy who acted as if he had lived in the neighborhood forever, even if he hadn't. His wife, Tina, was the more polished one, charming in a way that suggested she had perfected the art of small talk and social graces. They had 3 kids, Caleb and Ethan, 16-year-old twins, and Olivia, 12. The first time Derek had shaken Malik's hand, his grip had been firm, confident, almost overly friendly. "Welcome, man," Derek had said with an easy grin. "You got yourself a good spot here. That pool. My kids are already jealous." Malik had chuckled politely, unsure of how to respond. "Yeah, it's nice. Looking forward to settling in. If you ever need anything, just holler," Derek had continued. "This is a tight-knit community. We all look out for each other." Tina had chimed in with a practiced smile. "We do a lot of neighborhood get-togethers, block parties, that kind of thing. You should join us sometime." Malik had nodded, thanked them, and excused himself, eager to get back to unpacking. The Hendricks seemed pleasant enough, but there had been something about Derek's casual confidence that unsettled him, not in an overt way, just a subtle sense that this was a man who took up space, a man who assumed his presence was always welcome. In the weeks that followed, Malik had settled into a comfortable routine. His workdays were long, but his evenings were his own. He spent them exactly as he had imagined, lounging by the pool, reading on the patio, swimming laps in the morning before work. For the first time in years he felt a sense of balance. He also began to notice the rhythm of the neighborhood. The Walkers had their grandchildren over every Sunday, their laughter ringing through the cul-de-sac as they played in the front yard. Bryce and Natalie took evening jogs together, their baby snug in a stroller as they waved at passing neighbors. And the Hendricks. Well, they were the most visible and loudest presence on the street. Derek's voice carried over fences, whether he was laughing over a backyard barbecue, coaching his sons through a basketball game, or swapping stories with other neighbors in his driveway. The twins were just as lively, constantly bouncing a basketball in their driveway or blasting music from a portable speaker. Olivia, the youngest, often rode her bike in circles on the sidewalk, calling out greetings to everyone she passed. At first, Malik didn't mind. Sure, they were louder than he preferred, but as long as their energy stayed contained within their property, it wasn't his business. He kept his interactions polite but minimal, exchanging nods and brief hellos when necessary. For a while it worked. Until it didn't. It started subtly. A basketball bouncing into his yard here and there, laughter spilling over the fence during a particularly rowdy game, the occasional sound of voices near his backyard when he knew no one was supposed to be there. Nothing that warranted a confrontation, just small annoyances, easy enough to ignore. But then, one Saturday afternoon, Malek came home from a run and stopped dead in his tracks. A group of teenagers, none of whom he recognized, were splashing around in his pool, laughing as if they belonged there. His pool, his sanctuary. And among them, Caleb and Ethan Hendricks. Malek stood still for a moment, disbelief flooding through him. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he took in the sight of dripping wet teenagers lounging on his patio furniture, towels strewn carelessly across the deck, a couple of soda cans abandoned near the edge of the water. He clenched his jaw, forcing down the immediate surge of anger. This wasn't just an annoyance. This was a violation. Clearing his throat loudly, he took a step forward. The teenagers froze, their laughter dying as they turned to see him standing there. "What's going on here?" Malak's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. One of the boys, a curly-haired kid Malak didn't recognize, shrugged. "We were just swimming. Your pool's awesome, by the way." Malik exhaled sharply, leveling them with a look. "Yeah? Well, it's also private property. And I don't remember giving anyone permission to be here." Murmured apologies. Scrambling for towels. Awkward, sheepish glances as they hurriedly exited through the side gate, Caleb and Ethan among them. Malik stood still, watching them go. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides. This wasn't just about a couple of kids messing around. This was about respect. About boundaries. And something in his gut told him this was only the beginning. That evening, Malak stood at his kitchen window, staring out at the backyard, the once tranquil space now tainted by the intrusion. The water in the pool was still, but in his mind he could see them, Caleb, Ethan, and those other kids laughing, splashing, acting as if they owned the place. He had moved here for peace, for privacy, for a space that was truly his, and yet, barely a month in, he was already defending his boundaries. He set his jaw and took a deep breath, willing himself to approach the situation rationally. He wasn't going to lose his temper. He wasn't going to let his frustration cloud his judgment. But he also wasn't about to let this slide. By the time he stepped out of his house and walked the short distance to the Hendricks' front door, his emotions were carefully contained, though his patience was wearing thin. He pressed the doorbell. The chime echoed inside, followed by the muffled sound of movement. A moment later, the door swung open, and there stood Derek Hendricks, a beer in one hand, his other resting casually on the doorframe. His usual booming energy was present, his stance exuding the kind of confidence that suggested he had never had to justify anything in his life. "Malik, what's up, man?" Derek greeted him with a grin, taking a sip from his bottle. Like nothing was wrong. Like he didn't already know why Malik was here. Malik kept his expression neutral. "We need to talk." Derek's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, mild amusement. Maybe, or thinly veiled dismissal. "Sure thing. What's on your mind?" Malak folded his arms across his chest, his voice even. "I came home today to find a bunch of kids in my pool, including your sons." Derek let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "Ah, yeah, teenagers, right? Sometimes they don't think things through. He grinned, as if expecting Malik to laugh along with him. Malik didn't. I don't find it funny, he said, his tone sharper than before. I didn't move here to have random kids treating my backyard like a public pool. This is my home, Derek, my space. I don't want to see anyone in my yard unless they've been invited. And I haven't invited anyone. Derek took another sip of his beer, his grin settling into something more carefully measured. All right, I hear you, he said, holding up his hands as if to placate him. I'll talk to the boys. Won't happen again. Malik studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of sincerity. Derek's face was relaxed, easygoing, but there was something in his tone that Malik didn't trust. He nodded once. Good. Because if it does, I'm not just going to have a conversation about it. Derek's smile tightened ever so slightly, but he gave a short nod in return. Understood. Malik didn't linger. He turned on his heel and walked back to his house, pushing down the irritation that still lingered in his chest. For the next few days the peace held. No signs of trespassers, no sounds of splashing coming from his backyard. Malik let himself believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, Derek had actually taken him seriously, that the matter was settled. But then, Friday evening arrived. It had been a long, exhausting week. Work had been particularly demanding, and all Malik wanted to do was unwind. He pulled into his driveway, parked his car, and grabbed the takeout he had picked up on the way home, already picturing himself sitting by the pool, enjoying his dinner in silence. But before he even stepped inside the house, he heard the unmistakable sounds of people in the water. His stomach tightened. Malik closed his eyes for a brief second, inhaling deeply through his nose before turning toward the backyard. His steps were slow, measured, his exhaustion boiling into irritation with every footfall. When he rounded the corner of the house and caught sight of the scene before him, his blood ran hot. Caleb and Ethan were back, and this time they had company. A group of teenagers, at least 6 or 7 of them, were lounging around his pool, completely at ease, their voices loud, their laughter carefree, as if this was just another Friday night at their favorite hangout spot. And the audacity of it, the sheer blatant disregard, made something in Malik snap. He didn't hesitate. He strode forward, his presence immediately noticed. One by one, the kids turned to look at him, their expressions shifting from amusement to uncertainty. The music that had been playing from a Bluetooth speaker sputtered to a stop as one of them quickly shut it off. What the hell is this? Malik's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the edge to it. The teenagers exchanged guilty glances, none of them wanting to be the first to speak. Finally, Ethan, the taller of the twins, cleared his throat. We just thought, since it's hot out, maybe you wouldn't mind, he said, his voice half apologetic, half defensive. Malik's patience evaporated. I do mind, he said, his tone sharp, leaving no room for argument. I don't know what part of this isn't your property is so damn hard to understand, but let me make it clear, I don't want any of you here. Ever. Again. The weight of his words settled over them, the tension thick. For a moment, no one moved. Then, murmured apologies, the frantic grabbing of towels, the shuffling of feet as they began to file toward the gate. Malik stood unmoving, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, watching them go. Ethan muttered something under his breath to one of his friends, something Malik didn't quite catch, but the tone was clear. It was resentful, petulant, and it pissed him off. When the yard was finally empty, Malik exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. His backyard, the sanctuary he had envisioned, now felt like contested territory. He had tried talking. He had tried setting boundaries. And yet they had ignored him, had pushed past every warning, had disrespected his space without a second thought. As he stood there, staring at the rippling water, he made a decision. This wasn't just an annoyance anymore. It was a pattern. And if Derek wasn't going to put an end to it, Malik would. Saturday arrived with the kind of golden morning sunlight that should have promised a peaceful weekend. But for Malik Carter, peace felt like a distant concept, something just out of reach no matter how much he had tried to enforce it. The incident from the night before still lingered in his mind, a bitter reminder of just how little his words seemed to matter to the Hendricks boys. They had heard him, he knew they had heard him, but they didn't care. Their actions spoke louder than any excuses they could come up with. They saw his space as theirs. Malik wasn't about to let that slide. He spent the morning meticulously cleaning his backyard, reclaiming it, restoring it to the sanctuary it was supposed to be. He gathered the crumpled napkins, the empty soda cans, the stray towels left behind in the chaos of their unauthorized gathering. Each discarded item felt like an insult, a mark of carelessness, a reminder that this was all just a joke to them. As he scrubbed down the pool deck, the sound of a basketball thudding against pavement carried over the fence. Caleb and Ethan. Malik gritted his teeth and kept working, ignoring the way their voices occasionally rose in exaggerated volume, as if daring him to acknowledge them. By midday, the backyard was spotless. The water in the pool sparkled again, calm, undisturbed, the way it should have been. Malik stood by the edge for a long moment, letting the stillness wash over him, letting himself remember why he had wanted this place in the first place. It was his space, his rules. The sound of voices and laughter snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned toward the side gate, the very same one those kids had snuck through the night before, and a feeling of unease crept into his stomach. He knew that sound, that many voices in one place, that familiar bass of music humming just beneath the chatter. A gathering. A big one. Malik's jaw tightened as he made his way through the house, his steps controlled, his pulse slowly picking up speed. When he reached the front window, he saw them. A crowd of people moving in and out of the Hendricks' backyard. The driveway was already packed with cars, the street lined with more. A couple of neighbors people Malik recognized but had barely spoken to were arriving, carrying trays of food, coolers sloshing with ice. From where he stood, he could see Derek in the backyard, manning a large grill, flipping burgers while throwing back a beer. And there beyond the fence, just barely in his line of sight, was his pool. His yard. And Caleb, Ethan, and at least a dozen other kids were already back in it. A slow, seething heat built in Malik's chest. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate slap in the face. They had heard him. They had seen the way he had reacted last night. And yet, less than 24 hours later, they were right back where they weren't supposed to be. Malik didn't waste time. He grabbed his phone, barely resisting the urge to crush it in his grip, as he scrolled to Derek's number and hit call. The line rang once, twice, then. "Yo, Malik. What's up, man?" Derek's voice was too damn cheerful, too casual, as if he weren't fully aware of what was happening. Malik's fingers curled into a fist at his side. "Get your kids out of my pool. Now." A beat of silence. Then, a low chuckle, one that made Malik's pulse spike with irritation. "Ah, come on, man. Don't be like that," Derek said, his tone dripping with easy arrogance. "It's hot as hell today, and the kids are just trying to cool off. No harm, no foul, right?" Malik squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to breathe through the sheer rage clawing up his spine. "I'm not joking, Derek. I told you last night I don't want anyone in my yard without permission, and I sure as hell didn't give permission." Another chuckle, this one softer, condescending. "Malik, buddy, listen. We're neighbors. You're new here, but this is how things work in Willow Creek. We look out for each other. We share. That's what a community does." Malik's fists clenched so hard his knuckles ached. "Sharing implies consent," he said, his voice flat, controlled, but edged with unmistakable steel. "This isn't community hospitality. This is you and your kids ignoring every damn word I've said because you think you can." Derek let out a long, dramatic sigh, as if Malik was the one being unreasonable. "Look, man, if it's really that big of a deal, I'll round them up in a little bit, all right? Let them enjoy it for now. No need to make this a whole thing." Malik felt something inside him snap. His grip tightened around his phone. He had tried reasoning. He had tried setting boundaries. And yet, here they were. Again. His voice came out low, even, but unmistakably firm. "Derek, either you get them out or I do." A pause. The sound of voices carrying over the phone. Then, finally a shift in Derek's tone. "Don't do anything stupid, man." Click. The call ended. Malik stood there for a long moment, breathing, thinking, calculating. He could call the cops. Again. But what good had that done the last time? A warning. A meaningless lecture about respect. No, that wouldn't work. Not here. Not with people like Derek, people who laughed in the face of warnings, who mistook politeness for weakness. He needed something that would send a message they couldn't ignore. Something louder than words. Something they wouldn't forget. And slowly, as he turned back toward the house, a plan began to take shape in his mind. Malak Carter had spent his entire career solving complex problems. As a civil engineer, he knew how to plan, how to anticipate obstacles, how to execute a solution with precision. His work required patience, foresight, and a meticulous attention to detail. But standing there in his own kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter as he stared out the window at the crowd of uninvited guests in his backyard, patience was the last thing on his mind. He had tried to handle this the right way. He had spoken to Derek, laid out clear boundaries. Twice. He had confronted Caleb and Ethan, told them explicitly to stay out, and yet they were back, lounging in his pool as if they had never been told otherwise. Derek wasn't going to stop them. The cops weren't going to do anything. Malik knew that now. If he wanted his space back, he'd have to take it himself. His mind turned toward solutions. There was no point in another argument. Words had gotten him nowhere. He needed something bigger, something undeniable, something that would make it crystal clear that his pool was off limits. And then, just like that, the answer came to him. Pool maintenance. Malik moved quickly, heading into the garage where he kept his supplies. He had done his research. When he bought the house, he knew exactly what to do to restore a pool that had been contaminated by bacteria, algae, or excess use. The solution: superchlorination. A standard cleaning process that involved adding an excessive amount of chlorine to the water, rendering it unusable for at least 2 days. To someone unfamiliar with pool care, the transformation would be alarming. The water would turn cloudy. The chlorine would react with organic matter, releasing a distinct, sharp chemical smell. If done correctly, it would be completely harmless, but it would look toxic as hell. Perfect. Tuck. He gathered his materials, a large bucket of chlorine granules, a pH shock treatment, and, as a final touch, a harmless foaming agent that was sometimes used in themed pool parties. Not enough to create a full-on foam pit, but enough to give the surface of the water an eerie, unnatural effect. With everything ready, Malik made his way toward the backyard, his heartbeat steady, his plan clear. He wasn't angry anymore. Anger was unproductive. This was tactical. As soon as he stepped through the side gate, the energy in the yard shifted. The music was still blasting, the scent of grilled food filled the air. But one by one, people began to notice him. Conversations trailed off. The teenagers in the pool slowed their movements, their laughter fading as Malik crossed the patio, walking straight toward the water without a word. Caleb and Ethan were the first to go quiet. Derek, standing by the grill with a beer in one hand and a spatula in the other, finally turned. His expression was a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance, like a man who had just realized his fun was about to be interrupted. "Malik, my man, you finally decided to join the party." Malik didn't answer. He set down the bucket of chlorine, opened it, and scooped out a generous amount of granules. Without hesitation, he tossed them into the pool. Immediately, the water reacted. Tiny white particles spread beneath the surface, dissolving rapidly, releasing a sharp, potent scent. The water began to churn slightly, chemical reactions taking effect. A few of the kids started to shift uncomfortably, eyeing each other. They could smell it. Malak didn't stop. He grabbed the shock treatment, pouring it in next. Within seconds, the clouding effect began, the pool's pristine blue morphing into a murky, almost milky white. Now, everyone was watching. "What the hell are you doing?" One of the teenage boys in the pool froze, looking at Malik with wide eyes. Malak finally spoke. His voice was calm, even, but carried enough weight that there was no mistaking his seriousness. "Pool maintenance." Derek took a step forward, his grin faltering just slightly. "Hoo-ah, man, you sure that's safe? You don't want to be messing with." Malik cut him off by grabbing the final container, the foaming agent, and pouring just enough to send a light layer of white bubbles spreading across the surface. It wasn't enough to froth uncontrollably, but it was enough to look unnatural, enough to make people second-guess whether they should be in there. That was all it took. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. The teenagers started climbing out of the pool, dripping wet, muttering to each other. "What's wrong with the water?" Olivia, Derek's 12-year-old daughter, stepped back, staring at it. One of the other kids sniffed the air. "Dude, it smells like a chemical plant." Malik met Derek's gaze, steady, unflinching, final. "I told you before, Derek, this is my property. If you and your kids won't respect my space, I'll make sure you don't want to be here." Derek's jaw tightened, the easygoing facade slipping just a little. He wasn't used to being challenged. Malik could see it, could feel it in the tension rolling off the man. For a second, it looked like Derek might argue, that he might double down, try to turn this into some kind of neighborhood power struggle. But then he glanced at the pool, at the murky, chemical-filled water, at the way everyone was avoiding it now like it was radioactive, and his bravado wavered. Melissa, his wife, appeared at his side. Unlike Derek, she wasn't smirking or trying to play it off. Her expression was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Derek," she said under her breath. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. A long silence stretched between them. And then, finally, Derek let out a short, forced chuckle, shaking his head. "Damn, Malik," he muttered, scratching his jaw. "You really don't play around, huh?" Malik didn't answer. Derek exhaled through his nose, then raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. No need to be dramatic. We're out." And just like that, the party deflated. People started packing up, gathering their things, leaving in small clusters. Derek didn't say another word as he turned and walked back toward his own yard, but Malik caught one last look in his eyes before he disappeared, a mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. That was fine. Malik didn't need Derek to like him. He didn't need to be buddy-buddy with the neighbors. He just needed his space back. And now, he had it. As the last of the crowd trickled away, Malik turned back to his pool, now an unusable mess of cloudy water and light foam. It wasn't pretty, but it was worth it. He could clean it. He could fix it. And for the first time in weeks, it would stay that way. As he stood there, watching the last remnants of foam drift across the water, he felt something settle in his chest, a sense of finality. The message had been sent, loud and clear. The aftermath of Malik's stunt played out exactly as he had expected. The following morning, the Hendricks' backyard was eerily quiet. No thumping bass, no bursts of laughter, no basketball pounding against pavement. It was as if the entire household had gone into retreat, licking their wounds after being called out so publicly. For the first time since moving in, Malik woke up to the kind of silence he had envisioned when he bought this house. As he stepped outside with his morning coffee, the air crisp and still, he let his eyes settle on the now murky, foam-streaked pool. The water was an absolute mess, just as he had planned, but it didn't bother him. He'd start the cleanup process soon enough. What mattered was that it worked. No one had come near his yard since. Malik took a slow sip of his coffee, letting himself savor the victory, but a part of him knew this wasn't over. Derek wasn't the kind of man to let things slide. He had seen it in his face last night, that flicker of irritation, the tightness in his jaw. Malik had embarrassed him, made a fool of him in front of his friends. And Derek struck him as the type of person who valued his image above all else. So, Malik waited. For the next few days, the Cold War between the two houses settled into place. The Hendricks didn't acknowledge him, and he was fine with that. The twins didn't step near his yard, and Olivia no longer rode her bike up and down his driveway like she had before. It was blissful. But then, little signs of tension started appearing. One afternoon, Malik walked outside to take out the trash and noticed his garbage cans knocked over, trash spilling onto the curb. He knew damn well he hadn't left them that way. The next morning he found a basketball sitting in the middle of his yard, as if someone had purposely tossed it over the fence. Small things, petty things. Nothing that couldn't be chalked up to accidents, except they weren't. Malik didn't react. He knew exactly what this was a test. Derek was trying to bait him, pushing buttons, seeing if he'd snap. But Malik wasn't playing that game. Instead, he focused on reclaiming his space, cleaning his pool, restoring order. By the end of the week, the water was back to its crystal clear state, the last traces of foam gone. Malik let out a breath as he watched the light from his patio lanterns reflect off the smooth surface. Back to normal, just as it should be. But normal didn't last long. Late Saturday afternoon, as Malik was trimming the hedges along his fence, the familiar sound of footsteps approaching his driveway made him pause. He turned his head, and sure enough, Derek was standing there. It was the first time the man had spoken to him since the pool incident. His posture was different now, less cocky, more controlled. But there was something behind his eyes, something Malik recognized a challenge. "Evening, Malik," Derek said smoothly, his voice carefully neutral. Malik set down the hedge trimmers, brushing dirt from his hands. "Derek." Derek exhaled slowly, as if trying to pick his words carefully. "Look, man, I've been thinking about how things went down last week. Gotta say, that was a hell of a move you pulled." Malik didn't respond, just watched him. Derek let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Real creative. You made your point." His eyes flickered toward the pool, now pristine again. "I'll admit, I didn't think you had it in you." Malik's expression didn't waver. "And yet, you still thought it was okay to ignore every boundary I set." Derek shrugged, his easygoing demeanor still there, but there was an edge beneath it now. "I get it. You wanted to send a message." He tilted his head slightly. "But here's the thing, man. You and me, we're neighbors. And in this neighborhood, people don't usually handle things like that." Malik arched a brow. "Oh? And how do they usually handle it?" Derek's smile tightened, just slightly. "They talk. They work things out. Instead of, pulling stunts." Ah, there it was. Malik let the words settle between them, then nodded slowly. "You mean instead of listening the first time someone tells you to respect their space?" Derek's jaw ticked for just a fraction of a second, but his smile never fully slipped. "All right, look," he said, changing tactics. "We got off on the wrong foot. I'll admit, I should have taken you more seriously before. So how about we just move forward?" Malik crossed his arms, studying him. "Move forward how?" Derek sighed, gesturing vaguely. "No more games, no more drama. You do your thing, we do ours. And hey," he spread his hands, as if making a peace offering, "maybe sometime we can actually hang out like neighbors. Grab a beer or something." Malik didn't smile. He had spent years in corporate environments dealing with people like Derek, people who pushed boundaries, who only respected force, who played it off like a misunderstanding when they were called out. But Derek was finally conceding. Not an apology, but a concession. Malik let the silence stretch just long enough to make Derek uncomfortable, then finally nodded once. "Fine. No more games." Derek held his gaze for another beat, then grinned, as if that was exactly the answer he had expected. "Good talk. Asil." He turned and walked back toward his house, and as Malik watched him go, he knew one thing for certain. Derek Hendricks had finally learned his place. The weeks that followed were uneventful. The Hendricks stayed in their own yard. No more kids sneaking into his pool. No more loud, uninvited gatherings bleeding over into his property. For the first time since he moved in, Malik could actually relax. And to his surprise, the neighborhood itself responded. The Walkers, who had always been friendly but distant, started chatting with him more. Bryce and Natalie, the couple next door, invited him over for dinner one evening. Even Melissa Hendricks, who had largely stayed out of the conflict, stopped by once with a plate of cookies, offering a small, genuine smile before heading back inside. The message had been received. Malik had established his boundaries, and they were finally being respected. One Friday afternoon, as he sat by the pool, book in one hand, a glass of iced tea in the other, the faint sound of a basketball bouncing in the Hendricks driveway caught his ear. He glanced over, watching as Caleb and Ethan played a casual game of one-on-one. For the first time, they actually acknowledged him, just a nod, a brief glance in his direction. Malik gave a single nod back. A silent understanding, a truce. And as the sun dipped lower, casting warm orange hues across the water, Malik finally felt it, the thing he had been chasing since the day he moved in. Peace. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.